Talofa, Marole. Welcome to Pacific Level Up, which is a course designed for high school students, particularly Pacific high school students. Now, I'm Damon Salesa. I'm a lecturer in Pacific Studies, or at least I was. Now I'm currently Pro Vice Chancellor of Pacific at the University of Auckland. I was formerly the head of Pacific Studies at the University of Auckland. And this course is because, like everyone else, I'm stuck at home with hiding out from the coronavirus, keeping all our people safe. And our commitment, my commitment, is to teaching and to learning. And so I'm offering this course, which is basically a series of lectures which fit inside 900 seconds, which is 15 minutes. I'm going to be releasing these over the next few weeks. And the audience that I have here is my two daughters, both of whom attend the South Auckland High School. So they'll let me know if it's any good. How are we doing? Yeah, okay, we're doing all right. So who's this for? It is actually for high schoolers. It's for young Pacific people especially, like my two daughters, one of whom's got their hand in the air. Now, of course, I want everyone to watch this. I think everyone can learn something, but everything is for everybody. This is especially for young Pacific people. And when you see it, I want you to see yourselves in it. Because when people say something is for everybody, they often don't really mean it. So I'm meaning you guys, right here, Pacific kids, students, young people in Auckland. So the first thing I wanted to cover off in this episode, so episode 1, is why you should study the Pacific. Right, why studying the Pacific matters. And that's what you can do if someone asks you, for instance, if a teacher or someone on the street comes up to you and says, why would you want to study the Pacific? The first thing you should really do is pull some sort of face at them, because that is a stupid question. The second thing you should do is actually look at them and wonder why they're asking you that. They wouldn't ask you, why do you want to study the United States, or why do you want to study Britain? And yet they ask you that about the Pacific. And if they're asking you that in a place like New Zealand, well, that's a real warning sign, because New Zealand is in the Pacific. You can tell that because when you look at a map, we're surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. So that should be your first response. But the other response is to think 10 other ways to answer that question. Here's the first. Well, the Pacific is the largest thing on the planet. It covers fully 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Right? There is nothing bigger. Actually, if we got all the land in the world and we gathered it all together, we could drop it into the Pacific Ocean and it would sink. Right? And so that's another reason. And it's a pretty obvious one, why you'd want to study the Pacific. Why wouldn't you want to study the biggest thing on the Earth? And you can see that actually when you see images of the Earth spinning from space. Almost all the time, well, 1/3 of the time, you see the Pacific, right? It's easy to forget because often maps of the world cut in half on the Pacific, and I'll talk about that in the next episode, because that framing makes the Pacific look much smaller than it really is. Another reason, and one that we should put right up the front, is that we're living in the era where we're starting to really feel those massive impacts from climate change. And the place where we're seeing climate change happen first and most severely and affecting people first is the Pacific itself. Climate change, after the coronavirus probably, is the biggest challenge facing the world. And the Pacific is ground zero for that. And so if you want to understand climate change, partly because the Pacific itself and the temperature of the Pacific, its salinity and its level, are huge parts of the climate change story. So if you want to understand climate change, the challenge of this generation, maybe not right this month, you need to come and you need to study the Pacific. That's what scientists from throughout the world do. And people from the Pacific should look at the Pacific in the same way too. The third thing is that the Pacific, because it's 1/3 of the planet, because it's the ocean continent, as it's often said, is filled with a kind of natural and biological diversity that is truly astounding, especially in the water. So if you think of a place that has things like tree kangaroos, rainforests, volcanoes, it's the most active in terms of the continents moving. It is the ring of fire for the volcanoes. Flying fish and flying foxes, these are all things you find in the Pacific, and many of them you find nowhere else. And so if you want to understand just the breadth and depth and diversity of nature and biology, well, you come to the Pacific. Fourth reason is to imagine that linguistic diversity. If you imagine all of the world's languages, about 1/5 of the world's languages are right here in the Pacific. That's over 1,000 languages. Now those 1,000 languages are spoken by around 1% of the world's population. So 1%, that beautiful Pacific 1%, speak nearly 1/5 of, or around 1/5 of the world's languages, which means the Pacific is the most linguistically diverse place in the world. So if you want to understand linguistic and the impact of that kind of human diversity, the Pacific is where you should come. You know, often you hear stories about how people say, well, in New York City or in London, there are so many languages spoken. Well, probably there are as many spoken in a place like Port Moresby as there are in New York. And we don't celebrate that cosmopolitan nature because actually most of us don't even really know about it. The fifth is, if you live in the Pacific, you need to understand where you live, your region, right? This is from Mate Maatonga. Now, this game only makes sense, and the importance of this only makes sense if you understand the Pacific region as a whole. If you understand that Auckland is actually probably the largest Tongan city in the world. If you understand that Tongans have migrated to New Zealand and these numbers are not, for instance, migrated to Vietnam because of this historical relationship between New Zealand and Tonga. So if we live in the Pacific, we need to understand our region because the region shapes us. The sixth reason, and people will say, well, okay, it's only 1% of the world's population live here and many of the countries aren't very wealthy. Why do I care? Well, actually, although many Pacific nations are not that wealthy, the economy that is in the Pacific, the wealth of resources that Pacific nations hold, especially in really key things like fish, the fisheries, so the world's largest tuna fisheries are in the Pacific, or in minerals. Many of the world's key minerals are found in abundance, not just in land, on the land of the Pacific, although in places like Papua New Guinea and New Caledonia, there are enormous mining operations, and they're a mixed blessing, as we'll come to think about. There's also other things like at the seabed as well as on land. So there's enormous economic contribution that Pacific people make to the world, and especially to nations like New Zealand and some parts of the United States and Australia. A seventh reason to think about the Pacific is to imagine it as a place which people don't often imagine it as. People from outside the Pacific, and that's as a place of innovation and knowledge, of research and discovery. For me, two of the biggest ways we can see this is the world that Pacific people created long before foreigners came into the Pacific. They domesticated all sorts of plants that were still with us today. Plants like breadfruit, sugar, taro, probably bananas. Those crops were all domesticated, made edible and easy to grow by Pacific people. So they shaped the global economy through their innovations. And actually another way, and one that's often celebrated by Polynesian people and Micronesian people, is the voyaging. Pacific people had to cross this 1/3 of the planet. And to do that, they had to do it in ways with technologies that they had to discover themselves. Because by the time Pacific people got to very remote places like Hawaii, Easter Island or Rapa Nui, or Aotearoa, New Zealand, they got to these places when Europeans, for instance, hadn't discovered islands a few hundred kilometres off their coast. So they were the world's most advanced mariners for almost all of human history. Another reason, and the eighth reason on this short and dirty list, is geopolitics. Some people will tell you, foreigners mostly, that the Pacific doesn't matter. If you want to understand the way the world is, you have to look at the superpowers. You have to look at China and the United States. And that's fine, because if you look at China and the United States, you'll notice one thing, that sitting right between China and the United States is our beautiful 1/3 of the ocean, the Pacific. And that makes the Pacific ground zero for the most important geopolitical struggle of our time. And that's between China and the United States. And this is really common. If you imagine that the Pacific was one of the places where the Second World War was most heavily fought. It has long been a place of enormous strategic and geopolitical. That's politics and money and military and all those things. If you haven't heard that word before, the Pacific's long been a really important place for that kind of struggle. And so if you imagine the Pacific in the way that we actually experience it, not at the outskirts of world developments, but at the very center. So don't be confused by that. Ninth is cultural power. Now, I see this every day, and actually most young people in the Pacific see it as well. There's something enormously beautiful, of course, about our cultures, but they invest young people, old people, and particularly families with a huge amount of power, an ability to go forth in the world, to do great things and to be supported. That's why this 1% of the world's population has made such an enormous difference in the world. We have this enormous share of the world's languages, and with that go an enormous share of the world's cultures. And so this capacity that Pacific people have to express themselves, to be creative, to be loving, to be respectful, to stick to core values and virtues that are different to those from Europe are really, really impressive. One of the many things to celebrate and to study about the Pacific. The last one, and this is not the last of all possible reasons, the last of my 10 reasons, because my 900 seconds is almost up, is that if you're a young Pacific person, you are a child of this ocean. That means you should know about it, right? It means it matters because you matter. That's what the most important thing about understanding and studying the Pacific is, because it reminds us of our connection to the world's largest place, a connection that is deep and runs back for tens of thousands of years and connects us to some of the great human achievements which were conducted by our ancestors. So you are the sons and daughters, the children of the Pacific. Your story matters, and it means you should know it. Now, the next episode, which in theory is going to be tomorrow, is to think about where this name came from, Pacific. What is the Pacific, and what does it mean? Because it actually doesn't mean the same thing to everyone around the world. And as you can see, isn't a word that came from the Pacific itself. It came from foreigners. And actually, just a short heads up, at some point in the near future, a high school textbook written by myself, a bunch of colleagues and students, which is going to be available as a free ebook, is going to come out. So watch out for that, and watch out for episode 2. How'd I do?